El radioarte es la inspiración que se le hace al receptor al oyente que escucha a que pueda configurar un escenario propio. Se apela mucho al aspecto subjetivo del radialista, la persona que elabora esta pieza. Debe ser armónico, tiene que sonar bien. Es un género totalmente libre en su construcción.
Totalmente libre en su construcción.
Radio art is the invitation that we make to the receiver, the radio listener. Time to configure the space of their own. We appeal to the person who creates the piece, the artist's subjectivity. It has to be harmonic.
Los ingredientes con los que vamos a trabajar son los elementos del lenguaje, música, con efectos, con la voz, la palabra y con el silencio.
It has to sound good. It is a completely free genre when it comes to framework.
Música, con efectos, con la voz, la palabra y con el silencio.
There is no rigid diagram or structure that allow us to design radio art. You're listening to the noise of the message.
Para una mejor escucha, recomendamos el uso de auriculares.
Hello, check. Mic check.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
How are you doing? The same time over there? Probably, right?
No. Here,
No?
7 o'clock.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
4 hours difference. Okay.
Hi.
My friend.
This is Gerardo from Chile. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Victoria from San Francisco. Nice to meet you.
Cool. That's very cool. Thanks for being on our show.
No, my pleasure. Just double checking something. Okay, cool. Nice.
please.
Sure. Sure. My name is Victoria Shen. I'm a sound artist, experimental music performer, and instrument maker. And I'm based in San Francisco, California. And my profession right now is I'm a teacher, I'm a performer, a composer, and just overall an artist, I guess. And I see very little separation between sort of work and art, or life and art. So yeah, I guess that's in brief, if that's all right. Okay, yes. My sonic research is primarily in electroacoustic music, but right now I'm working at the computer music department at Stanford, so I also enjoy and can appreciate computer music, so like ambisonics, like DSP, sort of like acoustic modeling, this type of stuff that requires computers. But in my personal practice, I prefer things in like the electroacoustic realm, and I'll use digital things like microcontrollers to say like make turntables or something. Like I make my own turntables that have adjustable speed and direction, so stuff like that. But primarily it's electroacoustic. My background in sound overall is, as a kid, I always loved experimental music, like darker stuff as a kid, and then more just kind of like pure experimental electronics, this type of like early music exploration, like from like the advent of synthesizers. I was really interested in that. And then in college, I started working for a synthesizer company called Flower Electronics. And that was kind of my gateway into, say, noise or just noise electronics. And I was really fortunate because my gateway was through a woman, Jessica Ryland. And so a lot of times people ask me about what it's like being a female performer in a male-dominated field. And to me, it was kind of not very obvious. I didn't really like feel this sort of separation. I think mostly in part because I was introduced to this world through a woman. And yeah, so I was building analog synthesizers, and then I was doing a lot of stuff with like contact microphones, like amplifying various objects. And so in my current like live setup, I'm using things like an amplified bandsaw blade, amplified snare wire, and then also the most recent instrument that I've incorporated in my live performance is a collar with a guitar pickup with 2 bass strings. And then I play it by tensioning the end of the string by either pulling it with my hand or like putting it, like binding it around my foot and then like pulling, tensioning between my neck and my foot. So stuff like that. And a lot of thematic like return or whatever things that I see, motifs that I like to deal with, have to do with like the body and body specificity and like using the body or as a way to make sound through like extended technique and stuff like that. So that's just something that I've noticed. Anyhow, yeah, sorry, that was really long-winded.
good too. I was reading about your Beyoncé affair with the needle nails. How did that end?
Very, what is it? With a whimper, I guess. There's no bang. That experience was really funny. That day was very surreal. But they, you know, at the end, British Vogue did credit me. The creative director apologized. Beyonce's PR person apologized. And then they reached out a couple of months later and they actually wanted to purchase a set of nails, a functioning set of nails. And so they actually purchased a set of nails, right? And then I saw it like a few months ago. It was actually posted in an advertisement for Beyonce's record. Of course, this wasn't Beyonce's hand. It was on some like hand model or something, but it was like, get a Renaissance, nails by EVICSHEN, pick up your copy at Walmart, Target, Barnes and Noble. So it felt really gross to have my name like kind of uttered in the same breath as like these other tags, but some of it's fine at the end. It was like there's no bad blood or anything like that. And it was actually, I'm not going to say gracious, you know, it was really nice that they actually apologized because they really didn't have to. And yeah, so that was just kind of funny. I was really hoping for some sort of crazy, like, oh yeah, play in Beyonce's mansion type scenario, so fantasy, or like, oh, have like a live collab. That would be fucking amazing. Anyway, so it ended with a whimper, I guess you can say.
Apologized, and that's
totally,
yeah, and that's a real difference. We always remember this Negative Land U2 affair, which took so long.
Yeah,
and they were suing and countersuing, so it seems a really happier experience on your case.
Totally. I played with Negative Land a few months ago too, and they're so radical, still like anti-copyright. They like live and breathe this stuff, you know.
Absolutely.
The voice of the great horn owl is very deep. chords uttered in groups of 3, 5, or 6 are all on one key and in this rhythm.
do you consider to be the importance of noise and silence in your work, or in your performance, or in your compositions?
They're both incredibly important. I think the concept of noise very broadly is super important to have as an option for music, as a foil, as a simulacrum for music, right? So you say noise is the message. And I always think about this too, where like the signal to noise, like noise is the signal, right? Because like everybody's like, oh, signal to noise ratio, you want to minimize noise. And this is like the classic example that I use, which is like the Baudrillard's idea of Disneyland, right? Disneyland is a place where you go to convince you like, oh, look, there's this fantasy life, right? There's this fantasy area that you can exist in to convince you that reality is not fantasy, when in reality, it's all constructed, it's all fabricated. And so I feel the same way about noise to music, right? Like music, there's all these arbitrary rules, but all of these rules are mostly coming from, you know, a certain Western origin, right? And so I look to a lot of people like, you know, Harry Parge, or, you know, a lot of microtonal composers and stuff like that, or people who are doing like, say, gamelan. And it's like, yeah, so like they're kind of alluding and pointing to something outside. But I think also noise, even coming from a Western origin, is pointing to something that's outside. And like my background is in visual arts. And so I always tend to think about things in like visual art historical terms. And so I think about abstraction and painting and how radical it was at that time. And like kind of the mission of abstraction in that time was to kind of give people an aesthetic experience without an embedded agenda. And so it's like, oh, people can see this Pollock and then derive their own sort of like artistic interpretation. And like, that's where a real sublime artistic experience comes from. Of course, like my criticism of that is like, that's not true. It's like the whole frame around it. It's like, oh, everybody, we're framing this abstract thing and we're telling you that it's valuable. And so you're just kind of like deriving an aura, deriving a value from that. It's sort of like if you have a fucking piece of toast with Jesus on it, you can get a lot out of it, right? But it's because it has this whole baggage of meaning with Jesus and stuff like that. And so I think noise is really great because sound, abstraction and sound, I think still has a lot of radical potential to give people this sort of like painful aesthetic experience where they find themselves actually enjoying it and not really understanding why. I don't think that's true of painting anymore. You know, I think in part because sound has an ability to evade language in a way that visuals, you know, don't. And so I think because we're behind on that, there's still a lot of radicality and a lot of potential in the realm of sound. But of course, I understand that like us being practitioners are in the process of killing this, of like ossifying it. But you know what? It's necessary. It's kind of like the inevitable heat death is going to happen anyway. Let's just like revel in like the radicality while there's still something like that. Oh God, I was going to say something else about. Yeah. So with noise, even though there is abstraction, like if you just listen to, say, like a harsh noise track, you don't know who it's by. You don't know if it's just like a digital glitch or something like that, right? There's still no real aesthetic value. So context still gets read into it. Like, oh, it's Merzbow. Oh, it's this person. Oh, it's this a queer Asian American woman or whatever. So there's always a circulation of like meaning that gives you a framework to derive value. So I think like me being who I am, like I can use this tactically as a way to pose that which is like super meaningless, right? Which is just like pure noise. And that which is like very loaded with meaning, my identity, like my body, like the site that we're in, like the people that are around us, right? Like so specificities and non-specificities, like I call it the dump. I think I call it like the trash heap versus the void, right? And so like at that interface is where I want to like do this like tightrope walk. And I think that's the line. If we interrogate that, then we can find things out about ourselves, or I'm finding things out about myself. So that's my approach with noise in general. I think it's very critical, but it's not the only thing that's going to like inform us. And then what is the other question you had about silence? Oh yes, silence is also, really interesting. The silence is very loaded because there's never real true silence, and true silence is actually really, really dangerous and can fuck with your head if, say, you're in like an anechoic chamber or something like that. But in my own compositions, I think I use silence sparingly, but tactically in a way to like cut through like the sound through stark relief. So I want to create a composition, I think, like, you know, of course, like visually, like so if noise is kind of very concave, if it's like a positive relief, then like silence is like the negative relief, and so you have to work in this way to like sculpt something that's interesting to hear. I think that's it. Like you need to use silence in a way to highlight the noise or the sounds that you are making. I guess that's how I would think about it. Yeah, I don't think about silence in my personal compositions other than just being tactical and in terms of like putting things in relief.
I did this question because I found too much silence in your compositions and in your performance, and too much silence in the noise. Noise and silence are a cultural approach. Every civilization have their own approach to the noise and to the silence. So to me, silence does not exist. I can be a silent person, but my head or my brain explodes. It's very loud. Too much sounds, too much voices. And watching your performance, I found too much silence, too much calm in the noise that you do in your compositions, in your performance. Very interesting, as Gerardo said before. And this is my cat Greta. I want to do their own performance. Sorry, excuse me.
No, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
That's adorable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Excuse me. She needs to collaborate in the interview.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Say hi and say goodbye.
We should credit her, right? So she doesn't sue us when we publish it.
Yeah, right. was perfect. And it was a very complete answer. And I was impressed because I was watching, Franco and I were watching your performance at Option last year. And yeah, and it was very, very exciting and exhilarating. And that's, if we were enthused from the beginning, we were able to talk to Maria Chavez on Wednesday. So yeah, we told her we're going to talk to you too. And it was very. I'm going to ask about something about the wire cover, but later, because I'd like to mention something about your performance, because what you say in your website about the way you work and what happens and your constructions are like summed up in that performance perfectly, and it's very impressive. It's the way of how boundaries dissolve in terms of, is it performance art, is it body art, is it turntablism, or whatever. All these definitions became meaningless, and it seems to me that it's like the work of an artist on what's an artist supposed to do. Do you consider yourself an artist in that sense? Because Maria was telling us that she was a bad artist. She considered herself a bad artist. She insists on yeah, and in terms of that she's not informed, she's not attending to the latest currents or the latest trends. So she was very, very concentrated on her process and how I'm paying attention to that process as a sort of very profound way of also living it. And also it mixes up with these art life concepts which you were mentioning just before, which is very exciting, because it seems that in these times it's very difficult to approach those areas without or try not to get them detached successfully. So in that sense, my first question has to do with your use of your relationship with records and with turntables, and I was wondering about your record choices in terms of this manipulation you do, this extraordinary turntable you built, and how did you deal with copyright issues in those terms? I remember you said that in the interview that you had a sort of a Sade record mixed with some other things, which is like what Christian Marclay did sometimes, in a sense of cutting 2 or 3 records, just like Milenko Nijak. So I'd like you to start elaborating on that, your relationship with records, whatever angle you want to.
Sure. Just back to the, do I consider myself an artist question? Yeah, totally, absolutely. I think so, but I think it's like this definition I would play with very fast and loosely, because I also would consider myself a poet, even though I very rarely use words. But I think like the handling of materials in a kind of poetic manner still qualifies as such. And the qualification of good or bad, I'm not sure. I think I can be a bad artist in some ways. I think all good artists are bad artists too, depending on which way you look at it, right? But I think I'm a bad artist in that I have trouble focusing on, say, like a subject or material or like a kind of aesthetic even. I think my aesthetic is kind of like all over the place, and I'll do stuff like AI animation or like drawing or embroidery, this type of thing. So I'm probably a really bad artist in a way that it's very difficult to kind of put bounds on what my practice is. But at any rate, for records, I was kind of embarrassed to admit this, but now I'm sort of like, no, this is actually a feature, not a bug, is that I didn't grow up with records. I think I grew up with cassettes, was the earliest physical medium that I was actually using. And like, funnily enough, like my earliest audio memory was listening to like Beijing opera, like really shrill Chinese opera with my mom at a laundromat. We're splitting earbuds or something like that. And I think it's like a very sweet memory. And I used one of the first records that I duped was a Chinese opera, Peking opera record. But yeah, so my first like real engagement with vinyl was through the record art, which is that I released a record, right? And it was so funny because I felt so much pressure to release vinyl. People were telling me like, hey, you're not a real artist unless you have a like vinyl press, which is a really strange notion. But like, I mean, but somebody approached me, a buddy of mine, Jordan from American Dreams Records, and he was so down to do whatever I wanted because he was really attracted to the first cassette release I made where I was hand decorating every single cassette tape, every single cover using like soldering iron to draw into it, like copper tape, and then like also kind of like writing with thread. It was way too much. I would never do that ever again. And something else that I'll probably never do again was this release with Jordan. Like Jordan like completely supported me with this idea, which was I was making speakers at the time using a vinyl cutter to make planar speakers. So I was taking voice coils, which are normally three-dimensional, right? And it's wrapped around a magnet and it's like pasted to the back of a speaker cone. So I was taking that, but kind of just distributing the voice coil over a two-dimensional surface. And so this was like this whole process of like, okay, just making a pure spiral. Okay, now modulating the width of the spiral so that you can actually render an image. And so I was doing like composer portraits and then playing their compositions through their faces, this type of thing. And so I wanted to apply that concept to cover art, to album art. And so I used my face, and then that was the cover image, and I rendered it with a copper coil, and then that turned the jacket into a speaker to which you could listen to the record. And so that took a lot of time. I think it took like maybe 5 hours per cover, and then we did like an edition of 100. This was during the pandemic, thankfully, so nothing else was going on. So I guess that was time well spent. And so yeah, so that was my first real engagement with records. And then I had this record in hand. I was like, wow, this is like so fascinating. What can I do with this? Hitherto, I'd also been doing molding and casting. Like I had taken cassette tapes and then made molds out of them, and then cast using low melting point metals, cast like metal cassettes of pewter tapes. And that had this really lovely heft to it, and also like each one was like very unique because they had all these flaws and like holes and divots and stuff. And so I was thinking like, hey, would it be possible to cast records too? And so I was playing with the idea using microphonographs. Again, this is during the pandemic. And then I moved to San Francisco. It's my hometown where I came from. I had been in Boston at the time. I was there for 13 years. It was definitely time. Raccoons ate my chickens. So it was sort of like a sign like, okay, there's nothing really left here for me. And so I moved to San Francisco. After 7 months of couch surfing, I secured stable housing. And then I like started, I kept on going on with this record, Wormhole or Rabbit Hole. And then also right before the pandemic, I had made this glove that had tape heads on it. And so I was like trying to play tape by like running tape around a spinning cylinder and then just like running my fingers over the cylinder to like play with tape in a non-linear way. And so I think, you know, between that and like the record casting, that just kind of like set me up for like the needle nails, right? And so that was kind of, that came out very naturally, especially since right after college I was doing nails as a job and then also as an art piece. Again, the life, art, no separation, right? And then I was also playing with molding and casting stuff now that I finally had a place to play with molding and casting. And I was like so astonished by how good the fidelity is, duplicated records using this method of molding and casting. And of course, you can't just purely mold and cast. You have to do some kind of artistic intervention. And so I played with the Frankenstein record, just like cutting and recombining, but then duplicating that. So it's like, you know, people make these beautiful one-of-a-kind art objects, you know, these records, but then they have to like take utmost care of them. There's only one that exists. And so my friend Adam Theftible Scott, do you know him? IDM Theftible. He's based in Maine. Incredible performer. Like his practice is kind of similar to mine in that like there's no barriers. Like he'll use anything, but he's definitely a master of that. At any rate, yeah, he was like, oh man, the idea of like having a record with one scratch on it that has this like locked loop that you can never replicate any other way, like, and having duplicates of that, like that's just such an amazing kind of notion. And so I was like, yeah, send it my way and then I'll duplicate your records. Anyway, yes. So So before I get into copyright, I guess I'll just go into the other things that excite me about this workflow of using epoxy, which is that you can embed things in the resin, right? And so I was doing things like whimsical things like putting thread, like X-rays, even things like electronics. So I was like putting in these LEDs that are powered inductively through NFC fields. So like you can put it up to your cell phone and it'll go off and stuff like that. And then, oh yeah, I did a split with Aaron Dillaway where I took half of my record and half of his record, combined them, and then I put a zipper in the middle, and it's sort of like it just alludes to the splicing sort of quality to this methodology, and also it's kind of like a Sticky Fingers reference too. And yeah, and it sounds like really amazing, and it's really interesting thinking about this practice in conjunction with Maria's practice, because it's almost like this cyclical destruction, like destroy and create thing, where like Maria is like destroying and creating stuff, and I'm also destroying and creating stuff, but in almost like opposite ways. And so yeah, like splicing things to create like a whole record, right? Taking broken fragments, creating a whole record versus the other way around. And there's still the element of chance, right? Like you can kind of be like, oh, I like this area of the record. It's like kind of, I listen to a record, and then every time there's a moment I really like, I take a paint marker and then I hit the rim where it is. And so the area that has like the highest density of like marks, and that's just like, okay, this zone is the one that I want to curate. Anyway, oh, and then another thing that I've recently been doing is I wanted to approximate footwork music, like analog sampling or something. So I was like, okay, what is the BPM of footwork music? Like how much of a fragment, like what is the set, how long, what's the duration? How much of that is a fraction of a record? And so then I like did back of the envelope calculations, like, oh, okay, it's between like a third and a sixth of a record, like each sample lane. And so, sorry. And so I was cutting records up into thirds and sixths, and then just taking that fragment and duplicating that fragment over and over again until I could reconstruct a whole record. And so now you get this crazy like locked groove kind of sound effect. Depending on what the sample is, like it can sound anywhere between footwork or happy hardcore. It's mostly happy hardcore. But yeah, just working with this flow, just like figuring out how you can do cut-ups in a way that are elaborations on, say, like the old Christian Mark Clay, just like straight cut up. That's it. And then as for copyright, it hasn't been a problem for me. Like I'm not releasing like audio using copyrighted material. I'm just like selling objects or something like that. And I think, you know, I'm making so little money, or I have so little visibility, that it hasn't been a problem so far. But we'll see. We'll see how things shake out in the future. And knock on wood that I'll continue to go under the radar.
voice of the great horned owl is very deep. Calls uttered in groups of 3, 5, or 6 are all on one key and in this rhythm.
So nice to meet you. Yeah, so just let me know if you have any more questions for follow-up, and I'd be happy to answer them. Be around and chit-chat later.
Sure. It will be a real pleasure.
And I'm going to see Maria in like 24 hours, so that'll be cool too.
Big hugs from you too, for us from you too.
Absolutely. Sounds good. All right, y'all. Take care. Ciao. Bye.
El ruido es el mensaje.
Vamos por más, dice la rana, escúchame, ¿eh? Esto recién empieza.